The Bible is an interesting book. He began in a completely banal and open-ended sort of way. Let me be more specific. The Bible is interesting in the sense I mean it today, because although it may have had basically the same words in the same order for around 2,000 years, somehow it has, as I'm sure you know, the capacity to mean something different, really almost to be an entirely different book, depending on when and where it is read. Our cultural attachment to the Bible, especially among people of faith, is such that we are almost forced to reshape it regularly, from generation to generation. If we change, but the Bible continues to say and mean just what it said and meant before, then we become increasingly distant from it. So there are two choices. Either we try to match the Bible and stop changing as a society. Actually, we have to move backward fairly substantially for that to work. Or we keep changing generation after generation, and we take our interpretation of the Bible along with us. Obviously, that's what we do, right? We read the Bible differently as our own values and interests as a society change and grow. And importantly, this is how it has always been, right? Since today we're talking about David, I'm going to use David as an example of this phenomenon. So in the early first millennium AD, the ancient rabbis who wrote the Talmud debated what time in the morning David rose to say his daily prayers and what time he studied Torah. Now, there's a point in the Bible where David does pray once, that's true, but one would hardly consider David's prayer to be his defining feature. Right, so what the rabbis are doing, what we all do, is to remake David in their own image. Right? David becomes a rabbi. Right? The rabbinic David is not an inhabitant of the 10th century BC, but a rabbi of the 6th century AD. John Calvin understood David as a model of piety. Again, there may be a moment of near piety here and there in the text, but this is not, I think, exactly the image you get from reading the biblical story. Right? It is, however, the image that Calvin wants to imprint on his readers. So David becomes a vehicle for Calvin's message. In the early 20th century, the Zionist movement took claim of David, focusing on his martial exploits. Their flag bore and bears the ancient symbol associated with David's name, the Star of David. They had these barely functional explosives in the 1948 war that made more noise than they did damage. And they were nicknamed Davidkas, Little Davids, right, in this fight against these vastly larger Arab armies. In other words, David becomes the David and Goliath story, almost to the exclusion of every other part of his character and narrative. Michelangelo liked the David and Goliath story too, obviously. I mean, this is one that's always been popular to the present. But what we have forgotten over the centuries is that Michelangelo's sculpture was not meant to solely depict the biblical story of David's youth. Right, the piece was a political statement. Right, David's bold stance was meant to invoke the defiance of the Florentine Republic against its contemporary rivals. Michelangelo's David is a 16th century Renaissance man. Though it's hard to do without the benefit of retrospect, one might try and guess what sort of David we're attached to as a culture. We as always love David and Goliath, which has become effectively the primary metaphor for every political and cultural debate, regardless of the relative strength or size of the two sides. We are also in the unusual position of probably being the least biblically literate era in a few hundred years, if not longer, which means it is harder sort of to know how we as a culture are refashioning David. But for those who are familiar with the biblical story, at least in part, I might suggest that we are mostly in a David and Bathsheba sort of place right now. What I mean is that we tend to describe David as flawed, which we use, strangely, which we use to mean a reasonable model to aspire to. Not that we're going to go around murdering folks in order to sleep with their spouses. But we, like others in the past, take comfort in the notion that although David sinned and was punished, he was also forgiven, and God continued to love and preserve him. There's something very modern, very psychological and psychopolitical about this reading. Right? This is David as JFK. Right? This is David as Clinton. He's flawed but forgiven, right? Penitent and still quite popular. In other words, just as Calvin glorified David's piety, we have, in our own special modern way, glorified David's flawed nature. As his flaws, I think this truly, have become part of his glory. I mention all of this as a way of introducing a slightly more challenging notion that what we have been doing for 2,000 years, that is reshaping David to fit our own interests and values, is also what's happening in the Bible itself. I hope I'm not saying anything too radical when I observe that not every part of the Bible was written at exactly the same time. I don't want to step on any toes. In the case of David, there are 3 texts I want to think about particularly. The earliest is the story in the book of Samuel, which, as I will discuss presently, I think was actually written in David's own time, so around the 10th century BC. Then there's the broader history of the rise and fall of Israel as told in the book of Kings, which was written probably in the 6th century. And finally, there is the parallel history in the book of Chronicles, which dates to around 400 BC. What's important to realize is that only one of those books had any possible access to David's actual life. Right? And that's the book of Samuel. Kings and Chronicles were written 400 or 500 years later. They knew no more about David than what they read in the book of Samuel. Which is to say, they knew no more than the rabbis of the Talmud, Calvin, or you and me. And just like everyone else, they too recreated David according to their particular agendas. The authors of the book of Kings presented Israel's history as a judgment on the conduct of, not surprisingly, its kings. And the model for perfect kingship that they used was, naturally, David. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord as his father David had done. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, but not like his ancestor David. He did not do what was right in the eyes of the Lord as his ancestor David had done. See, these authors, you see, developed the notion that obedience to the law would preserve the royal lineage of David on the throne forever. David, therefore, had to be held up as the model of obedience, of doing what is right in the eyes of the Lord. Despite the stories, like the story of Bathsheba, that might indicate otherwise. When Chronicles is written, there was no more kingship in Israel, nor any hope of kingship. Israel was under Persian rule, and it was administered not by kings, but by the priesthood of the rebuilt temple in Jerusalem. So when Chronicles comes to tell the story of David, it has no use for the tales of how David achieved and kept power, no patience for politics really of any kind. David is refashioned as the founder of the temple, so that the priests could claim their own sort of lineal descent from Israel's greatest hero. In Samuel, we're told that David purchased the land where the temple would eventually be built and set up an altar there, but everything else is done by Solomon. In Chronicles, David purchases the land, sets up an altar, draws up the blueprints, solicits donations, provides the funds, hires the workers, appoints the clergy, establishes the guards, puts together the liturgy. Fully half of David's story in Chronicles is about the temple. There is no Bathsheba, no Absalom, there is no Goliath. This is the Bible refashioning itself. If this is all clear enough so far, I invite you to take one further step with me. That earliest narrative of David's life, the one found in Samuel, that text is refashioning David just as much as Chronicles or Calvin or anyone else. But instead of interpreting a text, the book of Samuel is interpreting events. Instead of trying to change the focus of a written story, the book of Samuel tries to change the focus of a lived story. What do I mean by that? Let me give you an example, and perhaps one that is vaguely challenging. Hundreds, thousands of years after David lived and ruled, and after the book of Samuel was written, none of us and no one really blinks at the fact of David's kingship. We know that David's story is of a shepherd boy from Bethlehem who rose to become king of Israel, and we read every word of David's story with that knowledge already in mind. So when Saul dies in battle with the Philistines, and this plundering Amalekite who takes Saul's crown brings it directly to David, who is living 150 kilometers away, we think, sure, that makes sense. Because we know that David is supposed to be king after Saul. God said so. Samuel anointed him. This is how we know the story is going to end. Now imagine you've not read the story in the book of Samuel, because it hasn't been written yet, say. And you lived through Saul's kingship. And you, logically enough, expect that one of Saul's sons will become king in his place. And somehow, weirdly enough, Saul's crown ends up in the hands of this guy, David. He's not one of Saul's sons. He's not from Saul's family. He's a shepherd kid from Bethlehem. He was a decent enough soldier once, but for the last year and a half, he's actually been working for the Philistines, Israel's archenemy. And if you don't remember that part, trust me, it's in there. What would you make of the fact that David has Saul's crown in his hand? Here's what you wouldn't think. That God had chosen David to be king. Because even if Samuel really did secretly anoint David, as the Bible says, even if he did, it was a secret. Even according to the Bible, no one was ever told that that happened. No contemporary of David's would have understood events the way that we do. We who have the benefit of the book of Samuel as a guide to explain it for us. But this story of David ending up with Saul's crown is one of many such stories in the book of Samuel. That is, stories in which a weird sequence of events transpires, at the end of which David is in an immeasurably better position than he was beforehand, but in which David himself seems to have played absolutely no part. Many of these stories involve deaths, either of those who stand in the way of David's path to the throne, like Saul and Jonathan, or of David's political opponents, like Abner and Ishbosheth, or even David's own children, like Absalom. So many people die around David. Every single time David emerges stronger. Every single time, the Bible tells us, David had absolutely nothing to do with it. In fact, every single time, David's not even in the room. The most striking example is this little-known story of Nabal, a rich man whom David, the Bible itself admits, targeted for a protection racket. David, at this time, is leading a band of misfits in the wilderness and tells Nabal that Nabal's shepherds haven't come to any harm while under David's protective watch. So could David and his men maybe have some supplies for their services? This is classic, perfect, mob-worthy protection racket. And this is what the Bible says David did. This is not me. Nabal refuses, and we all know what happens when the poor sap refuses. Except according to the Bible, it wasn't David who killed Nabal. Yes, the Bible says, David and his men put on their swords and marched up to Nabal's door. Yes, David explicitly intended to kill Nabal. But, mirabile dictu, actually it was God who struck Nabal down for... The Bible doesn't actually say what for. But the Bible's clear about one thing, it wasn't David. Even though at the end of the story, David now has possession of Nabal's precious supplies, probably his property, and certainly his wife, Abigail, who becomes David's wife immediately after Nabal's death. So is this really what happened? Are any of these stories really what happened? I want to suggest that they are, and they aren't. Let me explain first why I think the author of the book of Samuel was a contemporary of David. I think this because I know what it looks like when someone living well after David has a chance to write the story of Israel's great king. It looks like Chronicles, a whitewashed, cleaned up, perfected picture. Who, given the chance to tell the story of David from scratch, with no one to challenge him, would tell the story of Nabal and the protection racket? Who would admit that David worked for the Philistines? Who would want to reveal that David was forced off the throne by his own son Absalom? The author of Chronicles didn't. None of those stories are in there. These stories make sense, to me at least, only as reflections of real events, written by someone who, by virtue of common knowledge, could not get away with pretending that they had never happened. But as is always the case, admitting that something happened and interpreting that something, these are two very different things.